Space is cold, unforgiving, and about as welcoming as your ex at a wedding. The Refugee fleet, a ragtag ensemble of half-busted ships held together by hope and duct tape, drifted through the cosmos. Each vessel was a testament to the human spirit, specifically, its knack for getting into trouble and surviving despite every reason not to. On board the flagship, the valiant mockery Dr. Anara Voss was wrestling with what she affectionately called the unholy mess. In technical terms, it was the Neuro-Command integration sequence, a high-stakes mind meld intended to unify the fleet's leadership. In less technical terms, it was a recipe for disaster seasoned with a generous pinch of insanity. "Voss, how's it going with our brain soup?" Captain Harold Hal Grimes' voice crackled through the comms, as charming as a rusty airlock. "Oh, you know, Hal, just threading a needle through the synaptic spaghetti of a dozen egos," Anara quipped, her fingers dancing over the holo controls. "Piece of cake if the cake was made of nitroglycerin." The captain let out a dry chuckle. "Sounds like a party. Just make sure you don't blow us all to hell." "Well, that's the plan," she replied, toggling the neuro interface. The visor blinked to life, displaying the neural patterns of the so-called leaders. They were supposed to be the best of humanity, but in Anara's experience, best was a relative term often used by people who ranked themselves a bit too high on the food chain. She scanned the data, her gaze flicking over brainwaves like a gambler counting cards. "All right, boys and girls, time to play nice," she murmured, initiating the sequence. The process was a bit like trying to herd cats through a swamp, and with about as much success. Neural connections flickered and sparked, cerebral pathways twisted together like a nest of angry vipers. "Ah, the universal language of chaos," Anara muttered. The system hummed, screens reflecting the chaos within. "Could be worse," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "Could be on fire." But as the connections deepened, the jagged shards of their pasts rose to the surface. Memories, sharp and painful, scraped against each other. It wasn't unity that emerged, but raw, unfiltered trauma, bubbling up like the cork from a bottle of very bad wine. Anara winced as the system overloaded, alarms screeching like a banshee on caffeine. "Well, that's not good," she said, slamming a hand on the emergency kill switch. The holograms fizzled out, leaving Anara in the familiar silence of failure. She pulled off the visor, tossing it aside with all the grace of a one-star review. "Guess that's a no on the whole melding minds plan," Hal commented, his face appearing on a nearby screen, as smug as a cat in a sunbeam. "We're a little short of options here," Anara snapped, rubbing her temples. "Unless you want to try leading this circus solo." "Oh no, I'm much more comfortable sending you into the lion's den," Hal said, his smirk audible. "You have that way with people. If by way you mean a distinct lack of tolerance for idiocy, then sure," she replied, glancing at the readouts. "The thing is, Hal, these people have more baggage than a luxury space cruiser. And yet they trusted you," Hal pointed out. "The woman who thinks sarcasm is a love language." Anara leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. "Yeah, well, maybe it is. I'm still trying to figure out if I'm fluent or just an idiot." There was a pause, filled with the hum of the ship and the distant murmur of the fleet. Outside, the stars loomed, indifferent to the struggles of a few lost souls. "So what now?" Hal asked, his tone dropping the sarcasm for a moment of genuine curiosity. "Now," Anara said, standing up and stretching, "we try not to die." As if on cue, the ship shuddered, a deep, resonant groan reverberating through its metal bones. Anara and Hal exchanged glances, the kind that said, "Here we go again." "Report," Hal barked into the intercom. "Looks like our friends decided to drop by uninvited," came the voice of Lieutenant Sykes, as dry as recycled air. "Enemy vessels on approach." "Perfect," Anara muttered, grabbing her jacket, because things weren't exciting enough. She headed for the bridge, where chaos reigned like a badly behaved toddler. Officers scrambled, voices overlapping as they relayed information. The enemy, a shadowy force known only as the Collective, had been dogging their heels for months. Anara suspected they had nothing better to do, like cosmic stalkers with a grudge. "Status," she demanded, stepping up beside Hal. The captain's eyes were fixed on the view screen, showing the enemy ships like dark specters against the starry backdrop. "We're about to dance," Hal replied, his expression grim but determined. "Hope you're ready for the waltz." "I was hoping for a slow dance," Anara said, scanning the tactical readouts. "But I guess we'll take what we can get." The bridge crew moved with the precision of practiced chaos, each member a cog in the desperate machine of survival. Anara found herself swept up in the rhythm of crisis, her mind clicking into place like a well-worn puzzle. "They're jamming our signals," Lieutenant Sykes reported, fingers flying over his console, "trying to cut us off from the fleet." "They might succeed," Hal muttered, adjusting his headset. "Unless you've got another miracle up your sleeve, Doctor." Anara thought for a moment, her mind racing through possibilities like a rat in a maze. "We still have the neuro-interface," she said slowly. Hal turned to look at her, one eyebrow raised. "You mean the one that just shorted out like a toaster in a bathtub?" "The very same," she said, suppressing a grin. "But we might be able to use it to boost our signal, or fry our brains," Hal pointed out. "That's always a risk." "Wouldn't be the first time my brain's been on the grill," Anara said. "I like to keep it crispy." Hal hesitated, then nodded. "Do it. We're out of options." Anara returned to her station, fingers moving with familiar urgency. She bypassed safety protocols that were more suggestion than rule at this point, her mind focused on the task. The neuro-interface flickered back to life, the chaotic patterns of the leader's mind still swirling like a storm. Anara could feel the tension building, the pressure of their combined trauma threatening to break through. "All right," she murmured, hands steady on the controls. "Let's see if we can't make some magic." The ship shuddered again, enemy fire grazing its shields. Anara could almost hear the universe mocking them, a cosmic laugh tracked to their struggles. "Signals boosting," Lieutenant Sykes called out, his voice tinged with surprise. "We're punching through." Hal grinned, a fierce expression that was as much defiance as victory. "Looks like you did it, Doc." Anara allowed herself a moment of triumph before reality reasserted itself. "Don't celebrate just yet," she cautioned. "There's still a lot that can go wrong." "Isn't there always?" Hal said, clapping her on the shoulder. "But at least we're not dead yet." The battle continued, the fleet a shimmering dance of survival against the darkness. Anara knew they hadn't won, not by a long shot. But they'd bought themselves a little more time, and in the cold reaches of space, that was as precious as gold. As the enemy withdrew, the threat temporarily abated, Anara let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "Another day, another narrowly avoided disaster," Hal mused, leaning back in his chair. "Story of our lives," Anara replied, her tone wry. "But hey, at least we're consistent." The fleet regrouped, battered yet unbroken, their course set into the unknown. Anara knew the future was uncertain, the journey fraught with peril. But in that moment, with the stars stretching out before them, she felt a flicker of hope. "So what now?" Hal asked, repeating the question that seemed to define their existence. Anara shrugged, a small smile playing at her lips. "Now we find a way to survive." The captain nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Survive and maybe even thrive. One improbable step at a time," Anara agreed, her gaze fixed on the stars. And with that they sailed on, a fleet of refugees carrying the weight of humanity, snatching moments of triumph from the jaws of defeat, each heartbeat a testament to their unyielding will. And somewhere in the darkness, the collective watched, waiting for their chance to strike again. Anara loitered in the Valiant Mockery's mess hall, nursing a cup of something that claimed to be coffee but tasted suspiciously like engine lubricant. Around her, the atmosphere crackled with tension, the kind that makes you wish you'd invested in personal force fields or, failing that, a good set of noise-canceling headphones. Captain Hal Grimes was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, smirking like a man who just discovered his favorite brand of sarcasm was half off. "You know, I always said that trying to meld the minds of a bunch of egotists would be like herding cats, in space, with no air." Anara sighed, staring into her mug as if it held the secrets of the universe. or at least a better blend of coffee beans. Yeah, well, herding cats might have been easier. At least cats can't yell at you. True, Hal said with a chuckle. They just shred your stuff and pretend they did you a favor. The failed mind merge had done more than just fizzle out. It had left the fleet's leadership looking less like a unified command and more like a group of toddlers fighting over the last cookie. Each faction blamed the other for the neural breakdown, and the air was thick with accusations, as well as the occasional thrown object. Dr. Voss had hoped the Neuro-Command integration sequence would offer a semblance of unity. Instead, it had revealed the ugly, festering underbelly of human trauma, and now everyone was looking at her to fix it, or at least pretend to. Why do I feel like I'm stuck in an interstellar soap opera? Anara muttered, resisting the urge to throw her mug at the nearest wall. Complete with overacting and terrible plot twists. Hal grinned, that infuriatingly confident grin he wore like a second skin. Because, my dear Anara, that's exactly what this is, and you're the star. Or at least the understudy who got called in when the lead mysteriously disappeared. I've always wanted to be in showbiz, Anara said dryly, but I was hoping for a more glamorous role, maybe one with less existential dread. Outside the mess hall, all hell had broken loose. Leaders from the various factions that made up their ragtag fleet were at each other's throats, arguing over whose fault the botched mind meld was. Words flew like bullets and just as deadly if you were within spitting distance. Anara had a front row seat to the chaos. Admiral Fournier, a man whose ego could have its own gravitational field, was waving his arms like a windmill caught in a hurricane. This disaster is on you, Captain. Your incompetence put us in this mess. Hal shrugged, unperturbed. My incompetence. Hell, I thought it was my sparkling personality. Fournier's face flushed a shade that matched the emergency lights. Don't get cute, Grimes. We're teetering on the edge here, and while you're busy cracking jokes, the fleet's unity is crumbling. Unity? Hal replied, raising an eyebrow. Sorry, I must have missed the memo when we decided that was a thing. Anara bit back a snort, appreciating Hal's ability to needle people with the precision of a surgeon. He might be a pain in the ass, but at least he was their pain in the ass. Listen, Anara cut in, her voice slicing through the hubbub like a knife. We can point fingers all day, but it won't change the fact that we're in deep space with a target on our backs. We either fix this, or the collective is going to make this whole debate moot. The room fell silent, the gravity of her words sinking in. For a brief moment, the leaders were united in their collective fear. Fear of the enemy, fear of the unknown, fear of their own inadequacy. Admiral Fournier seemed to deflate, his bluster evaporating like mist under a harsh sun. So, what do we do then, Doc? It's your mess. Clean it up. Anara resisted the urge to flip him the bird, settling instead for a deep, weary sigh. All right, listen up. The Neuro-Command integration sequence was supposed to streamline decision-making. Instead, it dredged up everyone's trauma and dumped it on the table for all to see. We need to recalibrate, find common ground before we try again. Common ground, Hal repeated, his voice laced with skepticism. Got any idea where we might find some of that? I don't know, Hal, Anara shot back, exasperated. Maybe in your next shipment of impossible expectations. Hal chuckled, but the laughter lacked its usual warmth. Well, I've got a few crates of those lying around, along with hope and optimism, somewhere. All right, Anara said, holding up her hands in surrender. We need to get everyone on the same page, or at least the same chapter. I'll work on the technical stuff, see if we can't tweak the system to handle the trauma without imploding. And the rest of us, Fournier asked, his voice tinged with grudging acceptance. Start acting like the leaders you're supposed to be, Anara snapped. Talk to your people, get them on board. We're not going to survive if we're busy stabbing each other in the back. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, albeit reluctant. Anara felt a flicker of hope, though she knew better than to trust it. Hope was a sly bastard that had a tendency to vanish at the worst possible moment. All right, folks, Hal said, clapping his hands together. Let's get to work. We've got a fleet to save. The leaders dispersed, leaving Anara and Hal alone in the mess hall. She rubbed her temples, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down like an anvil on a flimsy ladder. You know, Hal said, leaning in conspiratorially, if this works, you'll be a hero. Anara snorted. And if it doesn't, I'll be the first one they toss out of the airlock. Either way, you'll make history, Hal pointed out. Yeah, as the idiot who tried to play God with a bunch of squabbling human brains. Hal chuckled, the sound low and rumbling. Well, at least you're in good company. Anara shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips despite herself. You're impossible, Hal. And yet here I am, he replied, spreading his arms wide. Still breathing, still causing trouble. She rolled her eyes but couldn't help feeling a spark of admiration for the man who somehow made chaos manageable. It was a rare skill and one she was grateful for, even if she'd never admitted out loud. All right, enough procrastination, Anara declared, pushing herself up from the table. I've got a neural interface to rewrite. Good luck, Hal said, offering a mock salute. Try not to blow us all to hell this time. Not making any promises, she replied, shooting him a wry grin before heading back to her lab. The lab was a mess, wires and cables strewn about like the aftermath of a particularly enthusiastic rave. Anara surveyed the chaos, rolling up her sleeves with grim determination. She dived into the work, her fingers flying over the holographic controls with practiced ease. This wasn't just about fixing a machine, it was about salvaging their fractured leadership, and hopefully, preventing anyone else from getting fried mid-mind meld. Ior's passed in a blur of data streams and code, her mind a whirl of calculations and hypotheses. She tweaked the interface, adjusting parameters, recalibrating the neural pathways to account for the unpredictable human element. Finally, she leaned back, stretching her stiff limbs and blinking bleary eyes. The adjustments were done. Now all that was left was to test it, and hope like hell it didn't implode. Hal found her slumped in her chair, eyes half-glazed with exhaustion. How's it going, Doc? Anara waved a hand dismissively. Oh, you know, just playing God with a side of mad scientist. Sounds like a party, he said, dropping into the chair beside her. Got a game plan? Yeah, Anara replied, rubbing the back of her neck. We test it, carefully this time. If it doesn't blow up, we get the leaders back together and give it another go. And if it does blow up, Hal asked, eyes glinting with mischief. Then I'll be taking early retirement, she said, deadpan. Preferably somewhere far, far away. Hal laughed, the sound a welcome balm to her frayed nerves. Well, let's hope it doesn't come to that. I'd miss having you around to keep me on my toes. Flattery, Captain, Anara teased, quirking an eyebrow. I thought you were above that. Not flattery, Hal retorted. Just a statement of fact, she snorted, shaking her head. All right, Captain Charm, let's get this over with. Together they headed to the bridge, the air thick with unspoken tension. The leaders were already assembled, looking like a particularly disgruntled jury summoned for a case they'd rather avoid. Anara took a deep breath, addressing the group. All right, folks, I've tweaked the neuro interface to better handle the emotional load. We're going to run a test, see if we can't get this thing to work without melting anyone's brain. Admiral Fournier gave her a skeptical glance. And if it doesn't work, then we're back to yelling at each other, Anara replied. Only this time we might not have the luxury of walls between us and the collective. A murmur of agreement, or at least reluctant acceptance, rippled through the crowd. Anara felt a flicker of hope, fragile and easily snuffed out, but there nonetheless. All right, Hal said, stepping forward. Let's give this another try. Worst case scenario, we get to blame Anara. Gee, thanks, Anara muttered, rolling her eyes. Always nice to know where I stand. With a nod from Hal, the test began. Anara's fingers danced over the controls, initiating the sequence with a mix of hope and trepidation. The neural patterns of each leader appeared on the screen, their minds interwoven like the world's most dysfunctional tapestry. Anara held her breath, watching as the system processed the data, the tension in the room thick enough to bottle and sell. And then it happened. A shift, subtle but unmistakable. The chaos coalesced into something resembling order, the disparate elements aligning in a way that suggested, just maybe, they were onto something. Anara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It wasn't perfect, hell, it was barely even functional, but it was a start. And sometimes that was all you could ask for. Hal's face split into a grin, relief mingling with triumph. Well, look at that, you've done it, Doc. Yeah, Anara replied, her voice a mix of disbelief and pride. For now, anyway. The leaders exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from cautious optimism to wary disbelief. It was progress, however tentative, and in their line of work, progress was a rare and precious thing. So what now? Fournier asked, his tone softened by the glimmer of hope in his eyes. Now, Anara said, turning to the assembled group, we try to keep this fragile unity from shattering. And pray the collective doesn't decide to crash the party before we're ready. Hal clapped her on the shoulder, his touch grounding her in the midst of uncertainty. One step at a time, Doc. One improbable step at a time. Anara nodded, allowing herself a rare, genuine smile. They had a long way to go, and the odds were stacked against them. But for the first time in a long while, she dared to believe they might just make it through. And somewhere out there, lurking in the void, the collective waited, watching, planning. But for now, all that mattered was the here and now, the fragile hope of survival. Anara Voss sat in her lab, staring at the blinking cursor on her console like it personally owed her money and was refusing to pay up. The Neurocommand integration sequence was a disaster waiting to happen, a fact she knew all too well. The leaders of the various factions were still reeling from the initial attempt, their psyches laid bare like a buffet table at a particularly messy family reunion. Now, she had to dig through the digital debris to find out why everyone's brains had decided that sharing was not, in fact, caring. Well, aren't you a cheerful little bastard? She muttered at the screen. She rubbed her eyes, trying to banish the fuzziness that came from too many hours spent in the glow of holographic monitors. All right, let's see what skeletons you're hiding in your closet. With a few swift keystrokes, she dove into the data logs, a digital spelunker in search of the source of the trauma. The sequence had dredged up something dark and old, like stirring the silt at the bottom of a stagnant pond. Whatever it was serious enough to make grown leaders squabble like children denied their favorite toys. Hours passed, each one draining a little more of her patience. Finally, a pattern emerged, not unlike a particularly ugly mosaic. The trauma seemed to stem from a historical event, something buried in the collective unconscious of humanity. Anara pulled up the relevant files, squinting as lines of text scrolled past. Figures, she said to the empty room, her voice dripping with sarcasm. The one time we actually file something correctly, it's our collective existential crisis. The event was one of the last great wars of Earth, when humanity had nearly wiped itself out in a fit of nuclear peak. The survivors had fled into space, carrying their fear and paranoia with them like particularly unwanted luggage. It was the kind of historical trauma that even the most optimistic therapist would have a hard time unpacking. So our big bad bogeyman is ourselves, Anara said, leaning back in her chair. Can't say I'm surprised. We've always been our own worst enemy. The door to her lab hissed open, and Hal Grimes sauntered in, his expression one of bemused curiosity. Talking to yourself again, Anara. They say it's the first sign of madness, says the man who once had an argument with the ship's AI over the proper way to make coffee, she shot back, not missing a beat. Hey, that was a legitimate dispute, Hal retorted, hands raised in mock surrender. So what have you got for me, Doc? Historical trauma dating back to the last days on Earth, she replied, gesturing at the files floating in the air between them. We're all still afraid of blowing ourselves up, even out here in the middle of nowhere. Hal whistled low, running a hand through his unkempt hair. Well, that's a cheery thought. The end of the world brought to you by your friendly neighborhood humans. Yeah, and now it's muddling up our attempts at unity. We're trying to mind meld leaders who are haunted by the fear of turning on each other. It's a recipe for disaster. What are you going to do about it? Hal asked, leaning against the wall with the casual grace of someone who knew he was annoying and relished the fact. Anara sighed, turning back to her console. I need to find a way to address the trauma, so I'm looking into old human cultures, see if there's anything useful. Hal raised an eyebrow. Old cultures? Like what? Sacrificing a goat under a full moon? More like meditation, rituals, stuff that might help them process the fear, she replied dryly. I'm not conjuring any spirits if that's what you're worried about. All right, Hal said, crossing his arms. Let me know if you need a hand. I'm always up for a bit of cultural appropriation if it means not getting blown to bits. Anara chuckled, despite herself. I'll keep that in mind. As Hal left her to her research, Anara delved deeper into the annals of human history, a veritable gold mine of bizarre, sometimes brilliant coping mechanisms. Meditation, communal storytelling, even dance, all methods ancient humans used to process collective trauma. If it worked for them, maybe it could work for the leaders of their bedraggled fleet. And so, armed with a few ideas and a healthy sense of skepticism, Anara set about her task. She'd need to convince the leaders that these ancient practices weren't just hokey rituals but legitimate tools for healing. A task easier said than done, given their collective tendency to scoff at anything that couldn't be quantified or weaponized. The next day, she called another meeting in the mess hall, which still smelled faintly of burnt coffee and desperation. The leaders were gathered once more, expressions ranging from curious to downright hostile. All right, Anara began, standing at the head of the table like a teacher facing a class of particularly unruly students. I've got a few ideas to help us address the trauma kicking our collective asses. Admiral Fournier pinched the bridge of his nose, his patience already fraying. This isn't about to get all spiritual, is it? Depends on what you mean by spiritual, Anara replied, folding her arms. I'm talking about using ancient human practices, like meditation and storytelling, to help process the fear that's keeping us from working together. And what? We all hold hands and sing Kumbaya, someone muttered from the back. Not unless you really want to, Anara shot back, unfazed. Look, this isn't about turning you into a bunch of flower children. It's about giving you tools to deal with the crap cluttering up your heads. Hal, ever the ally in mischief, chimed in. Besides, if it doesn't work, you can always go back to yelling at each other. We're practically professionals at that. A few reluctant chuckles rippled through the group, the tension easing slightly. Anara pressed on, sensing a crack in their skepticism. These practices helped humans through a lot of dark times, she said, her tone earnest. They might seem strange, but they're rooted in the same survival instincts that got our ancestors through their darkest days. Fournier sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. All right, Doc, we'll give it a shot. But if this backfires... Yeah, I know, Anara replied, her smile wry. Blame the mad scientist. With a plan in place, Anara set to work organizing sessions for the leaders. Meditation, storytelling, and a few carefully selected rituals formed the backbone of her approach. It wasn't about erasing the fear, but acknowledging it, processing it, and hopefully moving past it. The leaders were skeptical, of course. A lifetime of cynicism couldn't be unlearned in a day. But they were at least willing to try, and that was more than she'd hoped for. A few days later, Anara found herself in a dimly lit room, the air thick with anticipation. The leaders were seated in a rough circle, their postures varying from tense to downright defensive. Anara took her place among them, trying to ignore the creeping doubt gnawing at her insides. All right, she began, clapping her hands together. First up is meditation. We're going to focus on our breathing, letting our thoughts come and go without judgment. Hal, seated next to her, leaned over and whispered, If I fall asleep, feel free to kick me. Only if you start snoring, she whispered back. The meditation began, the room falling into an uneasy silence punctuated by the occasional shuffling of feet or clearing of throats. Anara led them through the exercise, her voice steady and calm, even as her mind raced with what-ifs. As the session ended, Anara studied the group, searching for any signs of progress. Most of the leaders looked, well, not relaxed exactly, but less like they were ready to jump ship at the first opportunity. It was something, at least. Next came storytelling, a surprisingly effective way to build empathy and understanding. Each leader took turns sharing tales from their past, stories of loss, survival, and the rare moments of triumph. As the tales unfolded, Anara watched as barriers began to crack, the leaders finding common ground in their shared experiences. By the end of the session, there was a palpable shift in the room. The leaders might not be ready to hold hands and sing Kumbaya, but they were closer to functioning as a unit than they'd been in ages. Anara allowed herself a small smile, relief washing over her. "Well," she said, rising to her feet, "that wasn't half bad. Let's keep this up and we might just survive each other." Fournier gave her a grudging nod. "Not a bad idea, Doc. I'll admit I didn't think it would work." "Yeah, well," Anara replied, shrugging. "Even a broken clock's right twice a day." As the leaders filed out, Hal lingered behind, his expression one of quiet amusement. "You know, you might just be onto something." "Don't sound so surprised," Anara said, rolling her eyes. "I do know a thing or two about human nature, believe it or not." "Fair enough," Hal replied, a grin tugging at his lips. "And hey, if nothing else, it's nice to see them not trying to throttle each other for once." Anara nodded, feeling a flicker of hope that she quickly squashed. Hope was a precarious thing, and she'd learned long ago not to trust it too much. Still, as she left the room, she couldn't help but feel that they were, at long last, moving in the right direction. Out in the depths of space, the collective waited, their intentions as inscrutable as ever. But for now, at least, the humans aboard the valiant Mockery had found a way to stand together, if only for a moment. In the grand scheme of things, it wasn't much, but it was a start. And sometimes, that was all you could ask for. As the enemy fleet's presence loomed ever closer, the valiant Mockery rattled like a tin can in a cosmic storm. The once vast, impenetrable emptiness of space was now littered with ships that probably had as much goodwill toward the humans as a cat does toward a bath. The enemy fleet's strategy was as subtle as a brick to the face: constant pressure, squeezed tighter and tighter until something popped. Dr. Anara Voss, meanwhile, found herself juggling her experimental peace therapy sessions and the increasingly frantic calls for solutions to the siege. It was like trying to meditate in a burning building. The valiant Mockery's mess hall was a hive of activity. Anara, clutching a mug of coffee that seemed more likely to kill than rejuvenate, made her way through the throng. The air was thick with tension and the unmistakable scent of stress-induced sweat. The leaders were gathered, arguing over the best way to handle the enemy fleet that seemed hell-bent on turning them into space debris. Captain Hal Grimes sat at the head of the table, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. His wit was sharp as ever, but even he was starting to feel the squeeze. "So, do we try talking to them or just moon them and hope for the best?" he asked, a sardonic twist to his lips. Admiral Fournier, always the optimist, sneered, "If you're willing to drop true, Captain, be my guest." For all the sarcasm and dark humor, the situation was dire. The enemy hadn't fired a single shot yet, but their presence was like a noose slowly tightening. Resources were dwindling, and the pressure was beginning to show in every frayed nerve and short-tempered outburst. Anara watched the bickering leaders with a mixture of frustration and resignation. Her experimental methods had shown some promise, but convincing hardened cynics to embrace ancient human coping mechanisms was proving to be more of an uphill battle than she'd anticipated. She needed them on her side, and fast, before the enemy decided to stop playing cat and mouse. She cleared her throat, drawing the room's attention. "Listen up, everyone. We need to focus on two things: keeping our wits about us and not letting the enemy exploit our internal discord." Fournier snorted. "Easier said than done." "Yeah, well," Anara replied, trying to keep her tone light, I'm a scientist, not a miracle worker, but I've seen some changes in your interactions, subtle ones thanks to our sessions. Maybe it's time to ramp them up. Hal cocked an eyebrow. Ah, more singing and storytelling. Maybe we can invite the enemy over for tea and biscuits. Anara rolled her eyes. Look, I know this sounds ridiculous, but we're running out of options. The enemy's out there, but we're in here tearing each other apart. We've got to keep it together or we're screwed. Fournier harumphed but didn't outright dismiss her. That was progress, albeit the kind you needed a magnifying glass to see. The rest of the group muttered their grudging agreement. Anara took that as permission to proceed with her dubious plan to save the day with the power of human resilience, or at least with the power of not completely losing their marbles. As the discussion wound down, an alert blared through the ship, a sound as welcome as a tax audit. The enemy fleet was repositioning, boxing them in tighter. Panic surged through the room like electricity through a faulty circuit. Hal stood, his voice cutting through the din. All right, everyone, enough hand-wringing. We'll get through this. Anara, keep doing whatever witchcraft it is you've got going. Fournier, let's see if we can fire up any old protocols that'll keep them at bay. With that, the meeting dissolved into chaos management, everyone scrambling to do something, anything, to stave off the inevitable. Hours later, Anara found herself back in her lab, the hum of machinery a comforting backdrop to her thoughts. She combed through the data from the sessions, looking for any hint of progress. The leaders were stubborn, their minds like rusty locks she'd been trying to pick with a toothpick, yet there were glimmers of hope, tiny, stubborn flickers that refused to extinguish. Hal, ever the glutton for punishment, popped in. How's it going, Doc? Better than expected, worse than needed, Anara replied, not looking up from her console. The sessions are getting through, but not fast enough. We need more time. Time's a luxury we don't have, Hal said, leaning against the doorframe. His casual demeanor was betrayed by the tension in his eyes. The enemy's getting twitchy, and so are we, Anara sighed, running a hand through her hair. I know. And with everyone so damn scared, it's hard to get them to overlook their paranoia and work together. Welcome to my world, Hal said with a wry grin. It's like herding cats with guns. Let's just hope we can keep them aimed at the right enemy, Anara replied dryly. The conversation was interrupted by another alert, a soft chime this time, signaling an incoming message. Hal glanced at the console. It's from the Collective. The Collective, that enigmatic group of ships shadowing them like a bad smell, had been unexpectedly silent. The message was brief and cryptic, a proposal for a meeting at a neutral location to discuss terms. Terms for what, it didn't say. Think it's a trap, Anara asked, voicing the obvious. Hal shrugged. Probably, but we can't ignore it. If there's even a chance to avoid a full-scale battle, we have to take it, Anara nodded. Just be careful, and remind them that we're not as dumb as we look, Hal smirked. Wouldn't dream of letting them think otherwise. With that, he was gone, leaving Anara to her work and her worries. The enemy was out there, the leaders were in here, and she was stuck in the middle with nothing but outdated human rituals and a dwindling supply of caffeine to keep her sane. The next few days were a blur of tense negotiations, both with the enemy and within their own ranks. The mediation sessions were ramped up, with Anara doing her best to keep the leaders from each other's throats. It was exhausting, like trying to teach a pack of wolves to share a single bone. The Collective's offer turned out to be as slippery as the rest of their tactics. They wanted something, but what or why remained frustratingly vague. Whatever it was, it kept Hal and the others on edge, constantly trying to second-guess the unseen adversary. During a particularly heated session, one of the leaders, Commodore Lynn, a woman whose patience was as short as her temper, finally snapped. Why are we wasting time with this nonsense? We should be preparing for battle, not sitting around like a bunch of monks, Anara sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. Because, Commodore, if we don't keep it together, the enemy won't need to attack. We'll implode all on our own. Fournier surprisingly backed her up. She's right. We've let our fear get the better of us before, nearly destroyed ourselves. We can't let that happen again." Lynn scowled but didn't argue further. Anara took that as another small victory, though it felt more like winning a game of chess with half the pieces missing. As the days dragged on, the enemy fleet maintained its silent vigil, an ever-present reminder of their precarious situation. The leaders, slowly but surely, began to show signs of cohesion. It was a fragile thing, like a soap bubble in a hurricane, but it was there. Anara clung to that hope like a lifeline, even as she steeled herself for the worst. They were running on fumes, both literally and figuratively, and the clock was ticking down to zero. ****, the inevitable confrontation came sooner than expected. The collective's fleet, tired of waiting, began to make its move. The valiant Mockery's alarms rang out, a cacophony of warnings that sent a shiver down the spine of every soul aboard. In the midst of the chaos, Anara found herself at the command center, surrounded by the leaders she'd been trying to mold into something resembling a team. It was a ragtag bunch, but it was all they had. Hal stood at the helm, his expression grim but determined. "All right, folks, this is it. We've got one shot at this, so let's make it count." The plan was simple, as most desperate plans tended to be. They'd use everything they had, every trick, every scrap of technology, every ounce of cunning, to break through the enemy lines and escape into the relative safety of deep space. As the battle began, Anara watched the leaders work together, not perfectly, but with a unity she dared not dream possible. It was a tenuous thing, forged in the fires of necessity, but it held. The ensuing fight was brutal, chaotic, and utterly relentless. The valiant Mockery shook with each impact, the crew holding on for dear life as they fought to stay one step ahead of annihilation. Amidst the bedlam, Anara couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. The leaders, for all their flaws and fears, were rising to the occasion, proving that perhaps humanity still had a few tricks up its sleeve. As the battle raged on, Anara found herself next to Hal, the pair exchanging a glance that spoke volumes. No words were needed. They both knew the stakes, the odds, and the fragile hope that guided them. With a final, desperate push, the valiant Mockery broke through the enemy lines, hurtling into the vast unknown with all the grace of a drunken swan. The enemy was in pursuit, but they'd gained precious ground, a chance, however slim, to regroup and survive. Exhausted but determined, Anara and the rest of the crew prepared for the next leg of their journey. The enemy was still out there, and the road ahead was fraught with danger. But for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, they were moving forward. As Anara settled into her seat, she couldn't help but chuckle, the sound of it unexpected in the silence that followed their escape. "Well, that was one hell of a therapy session." Hal laughed, a short, sharp bark of amusement. "Let's hope we don't need another one anytime soon." With the enemy still lurking in the shadows and the future uncertain, Anara knew they'd need every ounce of courage, cunning, and maybe even a bit of luck to make it through. But for now, at least, they had a fighting chance. And sometimes that was all you could ask for. The universe, in its infinite wisdom, had decided that today was a great day for chaos. Or perhaps it was just another Tuesday. The enemy fleet, ever so gracious, chose this moment to launch a full-frontal assault, breaking the uneasy silence like a drunk crashing through a church window. A cacophony of alarms erupted aboard the valiant Mockery, each one vying for the title of the most obnoxious sound in the galaxy. In the command center, the air was thick with tension and the unmistakable scent of recycled sweat. Captain Hal Grimes stood in the middle of the unfolding mess, the faint lines of stress etched on his face like a roadmap to the nearest mental breakdown. "All right, folks," he barked. "This is our darkest hour. Stay sharp and remember, dying is not on today's agenda." Dr. Anara Voss was already knee-deep in her usual juggling act, part mad scientist, part reluctant therapist. She glanced at Hal, her expression a mix of exasperation and grim determination. "You always know how to cheer us up, Hal." Hal shrugged, a smirk dancing on his lips. Just doing my part to keep morale high. Think of me as the ship's very own motivational poster." Anara rolled her eyes, returning her focus to the array of screens and data in front of her. The enemy was closing in, their ships forming a vice around the fleet, squeezing like a boa constrictor with a penchant for slow, painful hugs. The valiant mockery trembled under the relentless barrage, and Anara thought she could almost hear the ship's metallic groans of protest. "We're taking heavy fire," a voice shouted from the comms station, panic lacing every syllable. "Thank you, Captain Obvious," Hal muttered under his breath. "Anyone got any actual solutions?" The room was silent except for the ceaseless beeping of systems warning alerts, a symphony of impending doom. Anara knew they needed more than clever quips to survive this. She had a plan, at least, the skeleton of one. But it required cooperation from people who were more likely to bite the bullet than swallow their pride. "Hal, we need to get the leaders on board with this," Anara said, lowering her voice. "It's risky, but it might be our only shot." Hal met her gaze, understanding flickering in his eyes. "You want to risk it all on a half-baked idea. Every other idea's fully burnt toast. At least half-baked isn't charred." Hal nodded, turning to face the assembled leaders. "Listen up, everyone, Doctor. Voss has a plan, and it's as crazy as it sounds promising. We've got to work together, or we'll be space dust by supper." Commodore Lynn, eternally skeptical and permanently irritated, crossed her arms. "And what exactly is this miracle cure, Doctor?" Anara took a deep breath, outlining the plan that had brewed in the back of her mind like a stubborn cup of cold coffee. "The neurocommand integration sequence may have fried our brains, but if we can reverse engineer it, we could disrupt their command network. If it worked on us, it can work on them." Lynn snorted, a dismissive sound that could rival a horse's neigh. "And how do you propose we accomplish that without blowing ourselves up in the process?" "Details, details," Hal interjected with a wave of his hand. "The point is, we've got nothing to lose except our lives, and those are already on the chopping block." Anara nodded, adding, "We need to act fast. The enemy's closing in, and our window's shrinking faster than a cheap shirt in a hot wash." Fournier, the ever-optimistic thorn in everyone's side, surprisingly agreed. "It sounds risky, but so is doing nothing. Let's give it a shot." With grudging acceptance, the leaders began to organize, each understanding the stakes yet bracing themselves for the inevitable chaos. Anara knew they were playing a dangerous game, but sometimes the most reckless gambles paid off, or they got you vaporized. Either way, it was better than waiting to be picked off like sitting ducks in a barrel if ducks had barrels, or space fleets. As the plan was set into motion, Anara and a small group of allies worked in secrecy, their efforts cloaked under a veil of urgency and desperation. The atmosphere was charged with adrenaline, each move calculated, each step shadowed by the specter of failure. They were on the brink of success, or disaster, when the unthinkable happened. A betrayal from within as unexpected as it was devastating. It was Fournier. Of course it was him, the eternal optimist, now revealed as the proverbial snake in the grass. Anara had always thought his cheerfulness was a bit too saccharine, but she chalked it up to sheer personality flaw, not treachery. "Fournier, you spineless bastard," Hal growled, his voice low and dangerous. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Fournier's expression was maddeningly calm, his eyes devoid of the camaraderie they'd shared. "Surviving, Captain. Unlike you, I've chosen the winning side." "Winning?" Anara spat, incredulous. "You think they're going to spare you? Traitors don't get medals, Fournier, they get unmarked graves." Fournier shrugged, an infuriatingly casual gesture. "I suppose we'll see. But I'd rather take my chances with them than stay on this sinking ship." Hal was livid, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You've just signed our death warrants, Fournier. I hope it was worth it." As Fournier distanced himself, slithering into the shadows, the damage was done. The enemy surged forward, their assault redoubled in intensity, as if sensing the discord within the fleet. Anara watched in horror as the carefully laid plans unraveled before her eyes. The valiant mockery shuddered under the relentless attack, systems failing, alarms echoing like the funeral bells of a doomed ship. The darkest ire was upon them, and hope seemed as distant as the fractured stars beyond the viewport. In the chaos, Anara felt a hand on her shoulder, Hal's steady presence grounding her amidst the turmoil. "We're not finished yet, Doc," he said, his voice rough but resolute. "Not as long as we can still fight." Anara nodded, drawing strength from his determination. The betrayal had stung, but it hadn't broken them, not yet. With renewed purpose, she turned back to the console, her mind racing to salvage what she could from the wreckage of their plan. "All right, people," Hal called out to the remaining crew, his voice a rallying cry in the darkness. "We're not going down without a fight. Let's show these bastards what it means to be cornered." As the battle raged on, Anara worked feverishly, fingers flying over the controls, her mind a storm of calculations and possibilities. She refused to let their efforts be in vain, refused to let Fournier's betrayal be the final nail in their coffin. The valiant mockery groaned beneath them, but the crew held fast, their resolve unyielding in the face of overwhelming odds. The enemy might have had the upper hand, but Anara knew one thing: humans were stubborn creatures, and they were at their best when backed into a corner. As the ship's systems flickered and sparked, Anara found a glimmer of hope buried in the data, a vulnerability small and fragile but enough to give them a fighting chance. She relayed the information to Hal, their eyes meeting in a shared understanding. "It's a long shot," she admitted, a wry smile tugging at her lips, "but it's better than nothing." Hal nodded, his grin as sharp as a knife's edge. "Then let's make it count." With a final, desperate push, Anara and the crew launched their counterattack, exploiting the enemy's vulnerability with everything they had. The valiant mockery roared to life, the ship's beleaguered systems rallying under the strain. The battle stretched on, a dance of fire and fury, as the crew fought with a tenacity born of desperation. Anara watched as the leaders she'd struggled to unite finally came together in a symphony of chaos, their differences set aside in the heat of battle. In the end, it wasn't the plan that saved them, nor was it mere luck. It was the indomitable spirit of survival, the refusal to yield in the face of annihilation. Humanity's greatest strength, Anara mused, was its ability to adapt, to find humor even in the darkest hours, and to keep fighting when all seemed lost. As the dust settled and the enemy retreated, beaten but not vanquished, the crew of the valiant mockery took a moment to breathe, their exhaustion tempered by the sweet taste of victory. Anara turned to Hal, a weary but triumphant smile on her face. "Well, that was fun. Let's never do it again." Hal chuckled, a sound that was equal parts relief and disbelief. "I'll drink to that, Doc, assuming we can find anything stronger than this god-awful coffee." As the ship limped through the void, the crew nursed their wounds and counted their blessings. They'd faced near defeat and internal treachery, yet they'd emerged intact, if a little more cynical for the wear. In the quiet aftermath, Anara allowed herself a moment of reflection. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, they'd bought themselves a sliver of time, a chance to regroup and prepare for whatever came next. And as they sailed into the uncertain future, one thing was clear: they were still standing against all odds, and that, Anara thought with a smirk, was the best kind of victory there was. The valiant mockery's mess hall, that fine institution of culinary despair, was bustling like a hive during an apocalypse. Anara paused, taking in the scent of fear, sweat, and whatever passed for coffee these days. She half expected the air to be thick enough with panic to cut with a spoon. But no, life went on, even under siege. She found Dr. Voss buried under a mountain of data and a mountain of nerves. Her workstation was a disaster zone of papers, digital tablets, and a half-eaten sandwich that looked older than the war itself. Anara approached, her own nerves jangling like loose wires. "Voss, got a minute?" Anara asked, though it was less of a question and more of a polite interruption. Voss looked up, her eyes bleary and rimmed with the fatigue of too many sleepless nights. "If it's about the Neurocommand integration sequence, I'm already on it. Or what's left of it after it fried our brains and scrambled our leadership? Not exactly, Anara replied with a wan smile. More like how we can invert that disaster and turn it into a weapon. Make lemonade from nuclear lemons. Voss groaned, massaging her temples. You're asking me to make a bomb out of a mental breakdown, Anara. That's actually quite tempting. Think of it as weaponized therapy, Anara quipped. Take all that collective trauma and shove it right back at them. Therapy that kills, huh? My old professors would be so proud, Voss said, a hint of sardonic humor creeping into her voice. She turned to her screens, a new energy sparking in her weary eyes. All right, let's see if we can turn our dysfunction into destruction. As Voss worked her magic, or madness, depending on your perspective, Anara made her way to the bridge where Captain Hal Grimes was busy trying to look like he was in control of the universe, which, given the circumstances, was as believable as a politician's promise. Anara, Hal greeted, his voice a dry rasp. Tell me there's good news. I could use a nice surprise before we all become space debris. Good news is subjective, Captain, Anara replied, crossing her arms. But Voss and I do have a plan that might just turn our collective PTSD into a tactical advantage. Hal perked up, his interest piqued. You mean weaponizing our trauma? Now that's a fresh take on misery. Exactly. A shot of existential dread right into the enemy's neural networks, Anara said, grinning despite herself. If we can project our psychosis onto them, they might just short-circuit like we did. Hal whistled low, clearly impressed. That's either genius or insanity, but considering our options, I'm inclined to try anything once. Twice if it doesn't kill us. Commodore Lynn joined them, her expression that trademark blend of skepticism and grudging respect. So, our grand plan is to scare the enemy to death with our mental scars. I knew we were on the brink, but I didn't realize we'd fallen off. Think of it as a psychological blitzkrieg, Anara explained. We hit them where it hurts, in the brain. And we've got one advantage they don't: years of human ingenuity in the face of existential dread. Lynn nodded slowly, her skepticism fading. All right, let's harness our madness. God knows we've got plenty of that. The bridge was a flurry of activity as Anara and Hal worked to coordinate the fleet's fractured remnants. They needed to act fast, to unite their scattered forces before the enemy realized they were more confused than organized. Anara patched into the fleet-wide comms, her voice steady and firm. This is Anara. We're initiating Operation Mindstorm. Prepare to upload the collective emotional trauma data. It's time to give our foes a taste of human resilience and all its dark, chaotic beauty. The response was instant, a cacophony of acknowledgments laced with a mix of disbelief and grim determination. The fleet might be splintered, but they were still human, still capable of pulling together in the face of insurmountable odds. If there was one thing they knew how to do, it was survive against the backdrop of a cosmic-sized disaster. Hal directed his attention to the tactical displays, watching as the fleet shifted into formation. All right, let's show these bastards what a united front looks like. Even if it is cobbled together from the shards of our sanity. Anara took a deep breath, the weight of their gamble settling over her shoulders like a heavy cloak. This was a long shot, a very long shot, but it was their only shot. Let's just hope our minds are as terrifying as we think they are. Well, Hal said, a devilish grin spreading across his face, I've been told I have a personality that's hard to forget. Time to see if the enemy agrees. As the fleet aligned, Anara glanced at the makeshift command center, where Commodore Lynn was barking orders like a drill sergeant on steroids. It was a beautiful sight, in a way, watching chaos coalesce into something resembling structure. All systems ready, Voss reported from her station, her fingers flying over the controls like a concert pianist at a death metal concert. We're ready to unleash hell, or at least a mind-bending version of it. Hal nodded, his expression one of grim determination. Initiate the sequence. Let's give them a peek into our collective nightmare. With a single command, the Neuro Command integration sequence surged to life. Anara held her breath, watching as the data streams connected, intertwining with the enemy's networks like a spider weaving an intricate web. The effect was almost immediate. The enemy ships faltered, their movements erratic and disjointed. It was as if they were caught in the grip of a waking nightmare, their systems overrun by the chaos of human emotion. "Look at them," Hal marveled, his tone a mix of awe and satisfaction. "They're falling apart faster than a politician's promise post-election." Anara couldn't help but laugh despite the tension. "Apparently, our minds are more terrifying than their weapons." The enemy fleet, once a formidable force, was now a disjointed mess, their coordination shattered by the onslaught of human trauma. Anara watched in fascination as their ranks broke, ships colliding in a futile attempt to regain control. "Looks like they're having a bad day," Commodore Lynn remarked, a rare smile ghosting across her lips. "Serves them right for poking the bear, or the basket case," Anara added wryly. "Either way, it's nice to see them squirm for a change." As the chaos unfolded, Hal barked new orders, his voice carrying a note of urgency and command. "All ships, engage. Hit them while they're vulnerable. Let's show them the power of human resolve." The fleet surged forward, a wave of desperate determination crashing against the enemy's fractured defenses. It was a sight to behold, the culmination of their struggles and sacrifices finally bearing fruit in the most unexpected of ways. Anara felt a surge of pride as the valiant mockery charged into the fray, leading the assault with a ferocity that belied its damaged state. They might have been battered and bruised, but they were far from beaten. In the midst of the battle, Anara couldn't help but reflect on the absurdity of it all. Here they were, using their collective mental breakdown as a weapon, turning their darkest moments into a beacon of hope, or at least a weapon of mass disruption. If there was one thing she'd learned in all this madness, it was that humans were adaptable creatures, capable of finding humor in the darkest of times. And maybe, just maybe, that was their greatest strength. As the enemy lines began to crumble, retreating in disarray, Anara felt a jolt of satisfaction. They'd done it. Against all odds, they'd turned the tide, harnessing their despair into something powerful and devastating. It wasn't a clean victory by any stretch, but it was a victory nonetheless. The valiant mockery limped through the chaos, a testament to their resilience and irreverence in the face of annihilation. They'd survived, barely, but survival was enough, for now. As the dust settled and the enemy fleet retreated, Hal turned to Anara, his expression a mix of exhaustion and triumph. "Well, we've officially weaponized human misery. Didn't see that coming, did you?" Anara laughed, a sound full of relief and disbelief. "No, but I guess that's the beauty of being human. We always find a way to make the best, or worst, of a bad situation." Hal nodded, his gaze sweeping over the battered bridge, the crew rallying around them. "We're not done yet, but we've bought ourselves some time, and sometimes that's all you need to turn the tide." As the ship sailed into the uncertain future, Anara couldn't help but feel a sense of hope amidst the chaos. They'd faced betrayal, near defeat, and the overwhelming odds stacked against them, but they'd endured, united by their shared struggle and irreverent humor. In the end, it wasn't just their minds that had saved them, it was their spirit, their defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. And as they regrouped and prepared for whatever came next, Anara knew one thing for certain: they weren't finished yet. The galaxy might be a dark and dangerous place, but the crew of the valiant mockery was ready to face it head-on, with a few sarcastic remarks and a bit of gallows humor along the way. After all, what was life without a little chaos and a whole lot of laughter? Captain Hal Grimes leaned over the console, the bridge a chaotic symphony of stressed-out bodies and flashing lights. If there was a prize for the most frantic hornet's nest in the galaxy, the valiant mockery would win it hands down. "All right, folks," Hal's voice cut through the buzz, dry as a sandworm's underbelly. "Let's show these bastards the universe's finest collection of psychological baggage, and see if they trip over it." Anara Voss stood beside him, more of a reluctant hero than a willing one, her fingers dancing over her tablet. She already had enough on her plate without adding savior of the fleet to her resume. But here she was, spearheading the weirdest counteroffensive in the history of interstellar warfare. Human trauma as a weapon. Who'd have thought? On the plus side, if this fails, she mused aloud, we'll at least make a hell of a case study in catastrophic coping mechanisms. Hal snorted, eyes fixed on the tactical display. Assuming we're not all scattered atoms by then, Dr. Voss's neurocommand integration sequence was in full swing, transmitting every raw human emotion like a cosmic middle finger aimed straight at the enemy fleet. Years of therapy bills condensed into a single, potent payload. The alien ships wobbled and jerked, their smooth maneuvers devolving into a spastic mess. Guess they're not used to the full spectrum of human craziness, Anara said, watching the tactical display with a grim satisfaction. Commodore Lynn, pacing like a caged tigress behind them, chimed in with a sharp laugh. They thought they'd break us with firepower. Turns out they just needed a therapist. You'd think they'd learn, Hal added. Never underestimate the power of a species that invented both reality TV and nuclear weapons. The bridge crew, previously a strained and weary bunch, found newfound energy in their desperate gamble. Screens flickered as data streamed in, showing enemy ships colliding, their once impeccable formations now as ragged as a politician's promises post-election. The sudden chaos wasn't just a stroke of luck. It was a testament, or irony, of human adaptability. Not bad for a bunch of space refugees turned accidental revolutionaries. Looks like our therapy session is doing wonders, Anara quipped, her voice tinged with disbelief. Hal nodded, a grim smile on his lips. We've weaponized our misery. Who knew self-loathing could be so effective? Anara shook her head, half amused, half horrified. If this is what resilience looks like, no wonder our species is a mess. Outside, the enemy fleet's lines crumbled, retreat giving way to a full-on rout. The humans' deeply ingrained survival instinct kicked in, turning the tide in the most unexpected of ways. Move in, all ships engage. Hal's command was like a whip crack, sharp and decisive. The valiant Mockery charged forward, leading the ragtag fleet in a desperate assault. Their vessels, once disparate and disconnected, now moved with a surprising unity, driven by a common purpose and a shared madness. Anara watched the main screen, heart pounding. The enemy ships, once a terrifying wall of destruction, now looked more like headless chickens. It was hard not to feel a twinge of pride at the chaos they'd wrought. Looks like they're having a breakdown, Commodore Lynn observed with a smirk, eyes gleaming with the thrill of battle. Either that, or they need a lie down, Anara replied dryly. I recommend a long nap and a stiff drink. Hal's gaze was locked on the tactical display, watching the enemy unravel. Let's give them both. With a side of blaster fire, the fleet surged, a tide of firepower and desperation, hammering into the enemy's fractured defenses. It was a brutal ballet played out in the cold vacuum of space, where every ship was a dancer and every explosion an emphatic step. Remember, people, Hal shouted over the noise, we're not just fighting for survival. We're fighting for the right to laugh about this later. Anara chuckled despite herself. Let's just hope the punchline isn't our own funeral. The valiant Mockery rocked under enemy fire, shields flaring brightly against the onslaught. But they held firm like a rock against the storm. It wasn't pretty, but neither were they. Damage report. Hal barked, eyes flicking over the readouts. Shields are holding barely, Lynn replied, her voice edged with tension. Hull integrity's down to hope and prayer levels, but we're still in the game. Good, Hal grunted. No sense in going out quietly. Amidst the chaos, Anara was a flurry of motion, coordinating the fleet's movements, adapting to the developing situation. Every victory, every setback was a testament to human ingenuity and sheer bloody-mindedness. Hey, Anara, Hal called, a grin splitting his face. If we get out of this, drinks are on you. She rolled her eyes, unable to suppress a smile. If we get out of this, I'll buy everyone around. Hell, I'll buy the whole damn galaxy a drink. Careful, Dr. Lin chimed in. Cosmic tabs are a bitch to clear. As the battle raged, Anara felt a strange sense of calm amidst the chaos. They weren't just surviving, they were fighting back, turning their weaknesses into strengths, their doubts into determination. You know, she said, almost contemplative for a bunch of screwed-up space nomads, we're not half bad. Hal laughed, a sound full of grit and defiance. Damn right. Now let's remind these aliens why you don't mess with a species that laughs in the face of annihilation. The tide turned, slowly but surely. The enemy, once a formidable force, now resembled a disorganized mob, their cohesion shattered. Human resilience, with all its flaws and quirks, was proving to be their greatest weapon. Push forward. Hal's voice crackled over the comms, full of fire and vinegar. Let's send them packing back to whatever hole they crawled out from. The fleet rallied, a ragged cheer rising amongst the crews. It wasn't just a battle, it was a statement, a declaration of their refusal to go quietly into the night. They'd faced betrayal and despair, but now they were united by their shared struggle and irreverent humor. As the enemy lines broke and retreated, Anara felt a surge of triumph. They'd done it. Against all odds, they'd turned the tide, harnessing their collective madness into something devastating. It wasn't a clean victory, but it was theirs. Hal turned to her, eyes gleaming with the thrill of victory. Well, Doctor, looks like we're not dead yet. Anara smirked, a mix of relief and disbelief washing over her. No, but don't worry, there's always tomorrow. Tomorrow, Hal echoed, glancing around the bridge, where weary but triumphant faces met his gaze. Here's to tomorrow, then. May it be slightly less apocalyptic. As the valiant mockery led the fleet in pursuit of the retreating enemy, Anara knew they weren't done yet. The galaxy was a dangerous place, full of threats and challenges. But for now, they'd earned a moment of reprieve, a chance to regroup and plan their next move. All right, Hal said, clapping his hands together, who's up for a drink? I hear Anara's buying. The bridge erupted in laughter, a sound as defiant as it was joyous. They'd faced down the darkness and come out the other side, bruised but unbroken. In a universe that seemed hell-bent on their destruction, that was no small feat. As the ship sailed into the uncertain future, Anara felt a flicker of hope amidst the chaos. They'd survived betrayal, near defeat, and the overwhelming odds stacked against them. But they'd endured, united by their shared struggle and irreverent humor. In the end, it wasn't just their minds that had saved them. It was their spirit, their defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. And as they regrouped and prepared for whatever came next, Anara knew one thing for certain. They weren't finished yet. The galaxy might be a dark and dangerous place, but the crew of the valiant mockery was ready to face it head-on, with a few sarcastic remarks and a bit of gallows humor along the way. After all, what was life without a little chaos and a whole lot of laughter? The valiant mockery limped through the void, a battered testament to human stubbornness. The hull was scorched, the crew was exhausted, and the coffee was still as terrible as ever, but they were alive. Somehow, against all odds, they'd survived another day in this god-forsaken galaxy, and Anara Voss was starting to think they might just deserve a medal for it, or at least a good night's sleep. She sat in the mess hall, nursing a fresh cup of what passed for coffee around here, as she watched the crew stumble in, one by one. They all looked like survivors of a particularly rowdy bachelor party, disheveled, bleary-eyed, and just a little bit smug about the whole ordeal. Captain Hal Grimes wandered in, looking less like a captain and more like a man who'd just been told his ship had been downgraded to a space taco stand. "Morning, Doc," he grunted, flopping into the seat across from her, "or whatever time it is. Feels like we've been awake for a century. Tell me about it," Anara replied, taking a cautious sip of her coffee. It tasted like disappointment mixed with rocket fuel. "I think my brain's forgotten what sleep is." On the bright side, Hal said with a wry smile, "At least we're not dead." "Always a plus," she agreed. "Though I'm starting to wonder if we're just too stubborn to die." He chuckled, a sound that came out more like a cough. "If you ask me, that's humanity's greatest strength." too damn stubborn to know when to quit. The mess hall slowly filled with the groggy, yet inexplicably upbeat crew. There was a sense of camaraderie in the air, a shared understanding that they'd been through hell and come out the other side still kicking. Commodore Lynn joined them, her usual sharp-edged demeanor softened, if only slightly, by a rare smile. "I hear you're buying drinks, Dr. Voss. Only if we make it out of this alive," Anara shot back, setting her mug down. "Which, judging by the state of this ship, is still up for debate." Lynn smirked, eyes gleaming with mischief. "Well, we've got a reputation to uphold, don't we? Can't have the universe thinking we're anything but the most stubborn bastards around. Reputation's all we've got left," Hal added, leaning back in his chair. "Though I suppose we can add galactic therapists to our skill set now," Anara snorted. "I'm sure there's a booming market for that, assuming anyone survives long enough to pay." The mood was lighter than it had been in days, the tension that had hung over them like a storm cloud finally lifting. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in what felt like forever, it didn't seem quite as daunting. "Any word from Admiral Fournier?" Anara asked, shifting the conversation to the practicalities of their predicament. Hal shook his head. "Not yet. I imagine he's busy trying to figure out how to spin this into a victory speech, a toast to human misery," Lynn suggested, raising an imaginary glass. "The gift that keeps on giving, to misery," Hal agreed, clinking his mug against hers. "And to the fools who thought they could break us with it." As they spoke, the buzz of activity filled the air. Engineers and crew members hustled around, patching up the ship, redistributing supplies, and generally trying to make sense of the chaos they just endured. It was a sight to behold, messy, chaotic, and distinctly human. "Think we'll make it through the next round?" Anara asked, her tone more serious now. Hal's expression turned pensive. "We always do. Might not be pretty, but we're damn good at surviving." "Speak for yourself," Lynn interjected. "I plan on going out in a blaze of glory, not some half-baked salvage operation." "Whatever keeps you happy," Anara quipped. "Though personally, I'd rather avoid the whole blaze part." The banter was comforting, a reminder of what they were fighting for. Not just survival, but each other, their makeshift family forged in the fires of adversity. "Guess we should start thinking about what comes next," Hal mused, glancing around the bustling mess hall. "Can't just sit here and wait for the next disaster to find us." "Always the optimist," Anara noted dryly. "At this point, optimism's all we've got left," he replied with a shrug. "Help keeps the cynicism from getting too overwhelming." Lynn nodded, her expression thoughtful. "We've proven we can survive. Now we need to figure out how to thrive." The challenge was daunting, no doubt about it. But for the first time since this whole mess began, Anara felt a spark of hope. They'd turned their collective traumas into a weapon, used their weaknesses as strengths. It was a testament, no proof, of humanity's resilience. "I'll get started on the Neurocommand integration upgrades," Anara said, already mentally preparing a list of improvements. "We've got to be ready for whatever's next." Hal nodded appreciatively. "Good. We're going to need every advantage we can get." With renewed purpose, they set about their tasks, each one driven by the knowledge that they were part of something greater than themselves. A ragtag fleet of misfits and survivors, united by a common goal. A few hours later, Anara found herself back in her lab, surrounded by the familiar chaos of her work. She'd grown used to the clutter, the constant hum of machinery, the endless stream of data. It was her sanctuary in its own chaotic way. She worked methodically, tweaking the Neurocommand integration sequence, refining the algorithms, optimizing the system to ensure maximum chaos for their enemies. If they were going to survive in this harsh galaxy, they needed every edge they could get. "The human mind," she murmured to herself, "a puzzle even I can't fully solve." But that was just it, wasn't it? The beauty and the curse of humanity, unpredictable, messy, endlessly complex. It was precisely those qualities that made them so resilient, so enduring. And if they could harness that, channel it into something powerful, then maybe, just maybe, They could carve a place for themselves in this unforgiving universe. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the lab door. She looked up to find Captain Hal standing there, a bemused expression on his face. "Dr. Voss," he greeted, stepping inside. "Hope I'm not interrupting any groundbreaking breakthroughs. Just the usual chaos," she replied, setting down her tools. "What brings you here, Captain?" He paused, considering his words. "Wanted to talk about our next steps." "We've got a lot of options and not much time to decide." Anara nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "Well, I've been thinking, we can't keep running forever. At some point we need to take the fight to them." "Agreed," Hal said, eyes gleaming with determination. "But we'll need more than just bravado. We need a plan, a damn good one." She smiled, feeling an odd sense of excitement. "Then we'd better start brainstorming, Captain. We've got a galaxy to save." They spent the next few hours hashing out ideas, sketching plans, envisioning a future where they weren't just surviving but thriving. It was audacious, maybe even foolish, but that was humanity for you, always reaching for the stars, even when the odds were stacked against them. Eventually, their discussion wound down and Hal leaned back, a satisfied look on his face. "You know, Doctor, I think we might just pull this off." Anara chuckled. "We've come this far. No sense in stopping now. Here's to the future," he said, raising an imaginary glass once more. "May it be slightly less apocalyptic than the present." "To the future," she echoed, feeling a strange mix of hope and determination. As Hal left the lab, Anara returned to her work, her mind buzzing with possibilities. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and challenges. But they were ready, more than ready, in fact. For the first time in a long time, she felt like they had a fighting chance. The crew of the Valiant Mockery might have been a motley bunch of flawed, irreverent humans, but they were also resilient, resourceful, and, above all, united. And if there was one thing Anara knew for sure, it was this: never underestimate the power of a species that thrives on adversity. Outside, the vastness of space stretched out before them, filled with untold dangers and opportunities. But they weren't afraid. They'd already faced their worst nightmares and come out stronger for it. Anara smiled to herself, feeling a sense of belonging she'd never quite expected. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had also been transformative. They'd turned their trauma into strength, their doubts into determination. And as they looked to the future, they did so with a renewed sense of purpose. After all, in a universe that seemed hell-bent on their destruction, the crew of the Valiant Mockery was more than ready to fight back. With a few sarcastic remarks and a good dose of gallows humor, naturally. As the ship sailed onward, carving its path through the stars, Anara knew one thing for certain: they weren't done yet. The galaxy was vast and unforgiving, but so were they. And they had no intention of going quietly into the night. The Valiant Mockery might have been battered and worn, but it was still flying. As long as they had each other, and a healthy dose of irreverent humor, they could face anything the universe threw at them. And so, with a newfound sense of hope and determination, they pressed forward, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Because in the end, it wasn't just their minds that had saved them. It was their spirit, their humor, and their unyielding will to survive. In a galaxy full of darkness, they were a beacon of light, however flickering and stubborn. And as they continued their journey, they did so with the knowledge that they were stronger together, united by their shared struggles and irreverent humor. After all, what's life without a little chaos and a whole lot of laughter?